Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When Tom returned home after days at his father's hospital bedside, he expected peace. Instead, he found his lawn paved over, his wife's memorial destroyed, and a $19,000 invoice from an HOA he never joined. What followed was not just a fight, it was war, and Tom was done backing down. I pulled off the highway just after sunset, the Texas sky still bruised purple from the heat of the day, my daughter half asleep in the passenger seat, and my mind still stuck in the antiseptic corridors of the Houston hospital. 4 days of hard chairs, vending machine coffee, and listening to machines breathe for my father had drained me more than any oil field assignment ever had. All I wanted was to get home, unlock the door, and pretend for one evening that the world wasn't actively trying to test my patience. As the headlights swept across the front of the house, my foot eased off the gas without me even realizing it. Something was wrong, very wrong. Where my lawn should have been, thick, green, stubbornly alive despite the Texas sun, there was concrete. Not patches, not a path. The entire front yard was gone, buried under a smooth, pale slab patterned to look like stone. A new curb framed it neatly. Decorative rocks lined the edges, and right in the middle, staked into the ground like a flag on conquered land, stood a sign I had never seen before. Sunridge Oaks Homeowners Association, Unified Facade. Unified Standards. Welcome. I just sat there, engine idling, staring like my brain had decided this was too stupid to process in real time. My daughter woke up enough to squint through the windshield. Dad, did someone pave our yard? That was when my stomach dropped, not in a metaphorical way, in a physical, cold, hollow way that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. I got out of the truck slowly, like the concrete might vanish if I moved too fast. It didn't. I walked the length of what used to be grass, my boots scraping over something that still smelled faintly wet and chemical. The memorial bench was gone. The flowers my wife had planted before she died, torn out so cleanly it was like they'd never existed. In their place was a tasteful little square of stamped concrete, perfectly centered, perfectly soulless. Taped to my front door was a thick envelope. I didn't even open it inside. I stood there under the porch light, hands shaking now, and pulled out the invoice, $18,950, for mandatory aesthetic alignment within visual propagation zone, payable within 10 days. Failure to comply, it said, could result in a lien placed on my property. It was signed by the Sunridge Oaks HOA. I wasn't a member. I had never been a member. I bought this place specifically to avoid people like this. I called the police because I needed someone official to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. 2 officers arrived, polite but clearly confused, and walked the property with me while I explained, probably too fast, that I didn't belong to any association and had never approved any work. One of them called the contractor listed on the invoice. The guy showed up 20 minutes later, nervous, sunburned, holding a clipboard like it could shield him. He said he had a contract. He said it had my signature. When he showed it to me, I laughed once, sharp and ugly, because it wasn't even close. Whoever forged it didn't bother to match the slant or pressure. It was my name, written by someone who had only ever seen it typed. The officers explained carefully that since the work had already been completed and the contractor claimed authorization, this was heading into civil territory. They took a report for the suspected forgery and left me standing there with concrete where my lawn used to breathe. After they left, I called an independent appraiser I'd worked with years ago and begged him to come out the next morning. Even in the dark, I could see hairline cracks where water should have been draining. Whoever did this hadn't just erased grass. They'd messed with the land itself. As I stood there, my neighbor from down the road shuffled over, cane tapping softly against the pavement. He looked at the yard, then at me, and shook his head. He told me he'd seen the HOA president, a woman named Karen, on my property 2 days earlier while I was gone, walking around with someone she called an inspector, pointing at the ground like she was planning a remodel on a house she didn't own. I thanked him because that's what you do when you're trying not to explode. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with the invoice, the photos on my phone, and the quiet understanding that someone had decided my absence meant permission. The next morning, the concrete still looked just as wrong in the daylight. Somehow I'd hoped it would be less offensive when the sun came up. It wasn't. It looked like a corporate plaza had metastasized in front of my home. The early frost had settled in the seams like tiny white veins. The memorial patch where my daughter used to sit by her mom's flowers was now a sterile corner of polymer stone. The only good news was that the appraiser showed up right on time, jaw tightening the moment he stepped out of his truck. He walked the perimeter with a level and a camera taking photos, making notes. Halfway through his inspection, he squatted by the curb and muttered, "Jesus, they cut into your root line. You see this? They poured right over your subsurface drain. If the slope's even slightly wrong, runoff's gonna flow straight under your foundation." When I asked how bad it could get, he replied, "If it gets under the slab, it could crack. If it cracks, you're not talking about lawn damage anymore. You're talking tens of thousands in structural repairs." Neat. Once he left, I changed into a clean shirt, printed every scrap of property documentation I had, and drove 3 miles down the road to the Sunridge Oaks HOA office. The building was one of those beige prefab units masquerading as respectable architecture, columns that didn't hold anything up, windows that didn't open. I walked in past a fake fern and a receptionist with a bored look and a nameplate that said Amber. "I'm here to speak to Karen Whitman," I said. "It's regarding a bill I received." Amber's fingers stopped mid-click on her mouse. "Are you a homeowner in Sunridge Oaks?" "Not even a little." That got me a half blink. "I'll check if she's available." Karen didn't make me wait. She strutted out of her glass office like she'd been waiting for this moment her whole life. Early 60s, maybe late 50s, athletic tan, hair the color of expensive printer paper, not a line out of place. She gave me a tight, practiced smile and gestured toward her office. "Mr. Garrett, I assume." "I think you know who I am," I said, stepping inside. Her office was an altar to conformity. Neutral tones, framed landscape prints, one bookshelf of untouched HOA manuals. She motioned to a chair, and I stayed standing. "I received an invoice from your association," I said, "for nearly $19,000. I didn't request any work. I'm not a member. And I'd like to know what the hell is going on." She nodded slow and rehearsed. "Yes, Mr. Garrett. I assumed you might have questions." The improvements were part of a visual harmonization directive enacted by the HOA board under Guideline 4.2c. It applies to all properties that fall within the visual propagation zone of Sunridge Oaks. Visual propagation zone? Yes. Any properties visible from the main entrances or primary transit corridors of our community. "My home isn't in your community," I said, holding up my deed like a crucifix. "It's not in your legal boundaries." I specifically bought it because it wasn't under any HOA. Karen gave me the kind of smile usually reserved for misbehaving children and tax auditors. The propagation zone isn't about jurisdiction. It's about maintaining a unified appearance across our broader visual environment. You benefit from the property values in Sunridge Oaks. It's only fair that your property aligns with our standards. I blinked. "Let me get this straight. Because you can see my house from your sidewalk, you think you have the right to tear up my yard and send me a bill. We didn't tear it up. We improved it. And we submitted notice." "No, you didn't. No certified letter, no in-person delivery. Nothing." Her expression didn't change. "Our notice protocol is internal. Posting a public directive within our community satisfies the dissemination requirement. It's your responsibility to stay informed." I laughed, sharp and humorless. "That's not how any of this works. You poured concrete over my wife's memorial garden. You tore up drainage that's critical to my home's foundation. You faked my signature on a work order. That's not a guideline violation. That's a crime." Her smile finally faltered for half a second. The contractor was under the impression that the paperwork was legitimate. "If there was a clerical error, I'm sure we can resolve it civilly." "Clerical error? Are you kidding me?" Karen stood up suddenly, cutting the conversation short. "Mr. Garrett, we're not trying to antagonize you. We're trying to preserve the integrity of our neighborhood. If you disagree with the invoice, you are, of course, free to dispute it through the standard legal channels. But I'd remind you, failure to remit payment within 10 days will result in action to secure lien placement." She handed me a new copy of the invoice, this one printed on heavier paper. I took it without a word and walked out of that place like it was on fire. That afternoon, I scanned every document I had and forwarded them to my lawyer, Phil, retired federal prosecutor, now working civil litigation and real estate. He called me 20 minutes later. "Jesus Christ, Tom, did you piss off a cult?" "Close enough," I said. By evening, I had 3 emails from the HOA, one confirming the balance due, one reiterating the deadline, and one that included a PDF of the work agreement, with the fake signature still there, proudly sitting next to a forged HOA seal. I stared at it for a while until it stopped looking like a document and started looking like a weapon. The sun hadn't even broken over the ridge when I was already pacing across the newly laid concrete that was now my front yard, coffee in hand, rage on a slow boil. It wasn't just the absurdity of the situation, it was the precision of the violation. Karen hadn't sent teenagers to throw eggs at my siding. She'd sent a contractor with a forged work order and a full crew to erase everything that made this house mine. My wife's flowers, the bench I built for her, the soil we mixed with ash and prayer. This wasn't negligence, this was surgical. I wasn't about to let her get away with it. I spent that morning in full retaliation mode. First, I installed 3 weatherproof trail cams, one behind the old oak, one facing the drive, one over the porch. Not those cheap Wi-Fi doorbell toys either. Real infrared motion-triggered models that pinged my phone the second someone set foot on my property. If Karen or her little foot soldiers came back for a second round of unsolicited landscaping, I'd have them in high definition. Then I called Phil. "Look," he said mid-yawn, "I've read the documents. It's forgery, plain and simple. No HOA, no matter how drunk on power, has authority over a property outside its recorded boundaries. I checked the county assessor's map this morning. Your land is clean. The moment they stepped foot on it and made a physical alteration without your permission, that was trespass, destruction of property, and if they used a falsified contract, we're looking at wire fraud if any of it crossed state lines electronically." "Good," I said. "How fast can we hit them?" "We'll start with 2 things," he replied. 1, we'll file a police report for the forged document. 2, I'll file a cease and desist against the HOA and their contractor. Then we prep a civil suit for damages and injunctive relief. You'll want to hire an appraiser, by the way." "Already did," I said. "He says the concrete may have compromised the foundation drainage." Phil whistled low. "Excellent. That just added a few more zeros." That afternoon, I drove over to the county records office. I needed certified copies of my parcel data, plat map, zoning exemption, and HOA exclusion clause, all of which, to their credit, the clerk produced in under 10 minutes. I had them notarized before I walked out the door. After that, I swung by the sheriff's substation and filed the forgery complaint in person. The deputy on duty actually muttered, "Not them again," when I mentioned Sunridge Oaks HOA. That was a good sign in its own twisted way. On my way home, I stopped by Ron's place. He lived a few lots down and was known for having the best lawn on the entire road. The man trimmed his hedges with barber scissors. He was out on his porch reading when I pulled up. "Ron," I said, not bothering with small talk, "you see anything weird while I was gone last week?" His eyes narrowed behind his bifocals. "You mean other than the cement Nazis jackhammering your yard?" "Yeah," I said. "Like who was giving orders?" He set his book down slowly. "Karen was here. Tuesday afternoon. Drove up with some guy in khakis and a clipboard. She walked him around your yard like she was hosting a garden tour. I was out back, but I heard her say something about aesthetic harmony and eliminating variables. She even pointed at the bench, told him it was emotionally disruptive. Whatever the hell that means. That sealed it. She hadn't just authorized the work, she'd choreographed it. Back home, I uploaded the footage from my security cams, nothing from the past 24 hours, but I now had a system in place. I wasn't sleeping with both eyes open anymore. I had technology watching for me. That evening, Phil called again. "I've drafted the complaint," he said. "Named the HOA, Karen individually, and the contractor. Charges trespass, property destruction, fraud, and emotional distress. We'll also be requesting a full restraining order prohibiting the HOA from entering your property under any pretext." "Good," I said. "Serve it." "Oh, and Tom," he added, this kind of thing, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. If Karen was bold enough to do this to you, odds are it's not her first time." He was right, and that thought had been gnawing at the back of my skull all day. Karen was too smooth, too ready with the script. The sign they'd installed, the one with the HOA branding, that thing was professionally printed, staked in the dirt like it was a declaration of conquest. You don't do that for a one-off. You do that when you've already gotten away with it before. The next morning, my theory got back up. My daughter forwarded me a post from a neighborhood app, Sunridge Watch, or something equally Orwellian. Karen had made a statement publicly about bringing visual cohesion to edgelots. People in the comments were confused. A few cheered her on. Others asked, "Didn't that guy's house not even belong to us?" Someone replied, "Karen said he signed off. It's legal." A woman named Maureen chimed in, "She did the same thing to our yard last year, ripped out our mailbox and installed a brick one for the aesthetic. Sent us the invoice after. We paid it. Thought we had no choice." There it was. I reached out to Maureen that evening. She lived 2 streets away, just far enough from the HOA's core that her house was technically outside the covenants. She confirmed it. Karen had used the same language: visual zone compliance, inherited standards, non-member obligations. But Maureen had folded, paid the bill, didn't ask questions. She sounded both embarrassed and angry. By the end of the day, Phil had 3 affidavits: mine, Ron's, and Maureen's. We weren't just building a case anymore, we were building momentum. By the following Monday, the whole thing stopped feeling like a personal grudge and started looking like a slow-burn crime spree. The deeper we dug, the more rot we found beneath Karen's polished veneer of community standards. I'd always suspected HOA types of being control freaks with too much time and too little sense, but this was deliberate, structured abuse of power. The civil suit was officially filed by noon. Phil had it couriered straight to the HOA office, along with the cease and desist letter, the formal complaint about trespass and property damage, and a notarized copy of the forged work order, highlighted in glorious color. For good measure, we included a demand for immediate removal of the concrete slab and full restoration of the yard under supervision. We didn't expect compliance, of course. This wasn't about playing nice. It was the legal equivalent of throwing the first punch and daring them to swing back. Karen responded exactly as expected, not with a formal statement, not with a lawyer, no. She posted a public update to the HOA board's website under President's Notes. I nearly choked on my coffee reading it. Sunridge Oaks remains committed to protecting the aesthetic integrity of our community. Certain fringe properties, while technically outside HOA jurisdiction, fall within the visual spectrum of the neighborhood and therefore influence collective value. The recent legal posturing from one such homeowner is unfortunate and disappointing, but we stand by our standards. Beauty is not a matter of borders, it's a matter of principle. I couldn't decide if she was quoting Mussolini or Martha Stewart. Phil laughed when I sent it to him. Jesus, she's daring us to escalate. I like it. Makes her look like an arrogant idiot in court. Meanwhile, the contractor started sweating. A man named Denny Karp, mid-40s, sun damage, salt of the earth type who looked like he'd rather eat drywall than talk to lawyers. Phil got a call from Denny's attorney, who said his client wanted to cooperate fully. Apparently, Denny had no idea the contract he worked from was forged. When Karen faxed it to him, yes, faxed, like it was 1997, she claimed the original signature was on file. Denny came into Phil's office 2 days later and gave a full sworn statement. He didn't just throw Karen under the bus. He put her under the concrete mixer. She told me the homeowner was traveling, he said. Said he'd agreed verbally and we were behind schedule. She was pushy, real pushy. Threatened to blacklist me from future HOA work if I didn't move fast. I should have checked harder. I didn't. I thought I was helping some suburban cleanup job. Didn't realize I was paving over a memorial garden. His voice cracked when he said that. I believed him. The guy wasn't a villain. He was a pawn, one who realized too late that he was laying stone over someone's grief. That testimony gave Phil exactly what he needed. He forwarded it to the county prosecutor. The DA's office responded within 48 hours. A young assistant district attorney named Monroe called me directly. Said they were opening a preliminary inquiry into Sunridge Oaks HOA for misuse of funds, unauthorized work on private property, and potential document fraud. She sounded equal parts fascinated and furious. This isn't just bad optics, she said. If we find a pattern of coercion, misappropriation of HOA resources, and falsified communications, this could turn criminal fast. Good, I said, because Karen doesn't just need a slap on the wrist. She needs a spotlight and handcuffs. Meanwhile, I kept hearing from people. Maureen introduced me to another neighbor named Franklin, older guy, single, kept to himself. Karen had replaced his entire mailbox assembly without permission. When he protested, she claimed it had been voted on in the last board meeting. He wasn't a member. There was no vote. Just a fancy brick structure installed while he was in the hospital for surgery, along with a $600 invoice taped to his storm door. He paid it because he thought if he didn't, they'd come back and do something worse. He gave us a statement too. So did a younger couple, Jason and Alina, who lived near the back end of the development. Karen had sent them a compliance warning for having a red front door. They painted it gray, only to realize a year later that their property line was 10 feet beyond the HOA's official zone. Karen had lied. Again, the dominoes kept falling. Phil bundled all of it into an official complaint and sent it to Monroe. By the end of the week, she confirmed they'd opened a formal investigation. A county inspector showed up at my place to assess the drainage concerns. He took one look at the slope of the concrete and said, "Whoever laid this doesn't know what a runoff gradient is, or didn't care." I stood with him in silence for a few seconds, then said, "Can I sue them for being ugly, or is that just extra?" He smirked. "Well, if the water starts funneling under your slab and you get foundation shift, yeah. That'll be very real damage. Guess I'll pray for a dry spring." We shook hands. I didn't feel better, but I felt like the tide was finally moving. The kicker came on Sunday. One of the HOA board members, a man named Carl Bennett, called Phil out of nowhere, said he couldn't take it anymore, said Karen had been railroading votes, bullying dissenters, and threatening people with fines that didn't exist. "She told me she was protecting property values," Carl said in his sworn deposition. But it started feeling more like she was building an empire. He admitted Karen often skipped formal votes, made decisions by executive action, and doctored meeting minutes before submitting them to the HOA records portal. His voice shook while he spoke, like he knew he should have come forward sooner. Phil looked at me after reading the transcript. "We're not just suing a rogue HOA anymore," he said. "We're exposing a small-town dictatorship. And for the first time in a week, I actually smiled. I should have known Karen wouldn't go down without flailing. For a woman who built her life around vinyl fences, seasonal mailbox flags, and weaponized neighborhood unity, the thought of losing control must have felt like drowning. So she did what tyrants always do when cornered. She doubled down. It started subtly. An envelope in my mailbox, no return address, typed label, printed on cheap cardstock. Inside, a notice titled "Intent to Collect, Non-Compliance Fee." The amount? Exactly $18,950. Again. Apparently, having a pending lawsuit didn't stop the HOA from playing pretend. The letter claimed I had failed to satisfy dues related to property aesthetic violations, and that the HOA would be initiating lien proceedings to protect the financial interests of the community. The language was hilariously overconfident for a threat with no teeth, but still, when you're facing someone willing to forge your signature, it's not just paperwork. It's psychological warfare. I sent it to Phil, who called it legally meaningless garbage, but added, "It's also laying groundwork for harassment. Let them keep it up. It helps us." 2 days later, they kept it up. I came home from work and found two men in ill-fitting polo shirts standing on my front path. One of them was snapping photos of my driveway. The other was holding a clipboard. They wore laminated badges that said, "Compliance Officer, Sunridge Oaks, HOA." I pulled into the drive slow, real slow, then got out and calmly asked them who the hell they thought they were. The taller one answered, trying to sound authoritative. "Sir, we're conducting an inspection as part of a pending lien assessment. Your property is non-compliant with mandated facade standards." "You're standing on private property," I said. "And you're about to get trespassing charges filed on top of whatever HOA fantasy you're playing dress-up in." He blinked. "We're authorized representatives." "No, you're not," I said, pulling out my phone. "You're two guys with name tags made on a Staples printer, and you've got 10 seconds to get off my land before I call the sheriff and show them the restraining order in my glove box." They left, slowly, taking a few more pictures as they backed off, like it would somehow retroactively legalize their little invasion. I reported the incident to the sheriff's office. Again. They promised to follow up. Again. Then the emails started. Photoshopped images. Doctored time-stamped pictures of my lawn before improvements. Completely fake. One even had a date from last summer, showing an overgrown yard with weeds waist-high and a tipped-over trash bin. I zoomed in on the photo. There was a newspaper visible in the corner. I looked up the front page. It was from 2019. I hadn't even lived in the house yet. Phil called it a low-effort smear campaign, but it still made him angry. They're manufacturing a narrative, he said, trying to poison public perception before the hearing. It's sloppy but effective with the gullible. The good news: every single email went into our evidence file. Every one of Karen's digital fingerprints added fuel to the fire. But the best development came 2 days later. We got an anonymous tip. An envelope slid under Phil's office door. No return address. Inside, a printed copy of HOA internal meeting, minutes from 6 months ago. Highlighted sections showed Karen proposing the Visual Propagation Zone Enforcement Protocol as a non-voting action under emergency aesthetic authority. That wasn't just gibberish, it was non-binding gibberish. HOA bylaws require majority board approval for any new enforcement rules, especially ones that affect non-member properties. According to the document, only Karen and one other member had signed off. The others weren't even present. It was signed in ink by Carl Bennett. Phil got Carl back on the phone. "Is this real?" he asked. Carl sighed. "Yeah, she told us it wasn't an official vote, just a concept. I didn't know she filed it like it passed. She even told me she had legal cover to enforce it." "She lied," Phil said. "To you and everyone else. And now it's part of a criminal investigation." Carl agreed to testify, under oath, that he had never voted to authorize Karen's visual zone policy. That put Karen squarely on the hook for unilateral abuse of position. By then, the media caught wind. A local blog ran a short post. "Lawsuit filed against rogue HOA. Property owner claims concrete retaliation." The headline made me sound like a tinfoil hat guy, but the content was accurate. And once the story went up, the comments poured in. Other homeowners, some anonymous, some brave, started coming forward. "She fined me for not watering my lawn during a drought restriction. She removed my political sign, claiming it violated community neutrality. I live 5 houses outside the HOA. She told my wife that our curtains lowered neighborhood morale." It was like lifting the lid on a septic tank. That week, Phil amended the suit to include new plaintiffs: Maureen, Franklin, Jason, and Alina, even Carl. It wasn't just my case anymore, it was a class action. And with that, Karen made one last desperate move. She hired a PR firm. Within 48 hours, a glossy flyer appeared in every mailbox within 3 miles. Sunridge Oaks, a community of vision. It featured stock photos of smiling families and freshly mowed lawns. Karen's face appeared at the bottom next to a message: "Preserving our standards, defending our future. Together." My daughter picked it up off the porch and deadpanned. "So, this is what fascism looks like in pastel." Phil laughed for a full minute when I told him, but beneath the jokes, I could feel the pressure building. Karen wasn't just trying to win in court. She was trying to win in the court of public opinion. She was cornered, but not broken. Not yet. By the time we stepped into the courtroom, the story had already outgrown me. It wasn't just about concrete anymore. It wasn't even about Karen. It had become something uglier. How far authority could go unchecked when nobody dared to challenge it. And now we were challenging it, with everything we had. The courtroom itself was smaller than I expected. No wood-paneled grandeur, no soaring ceilings, just a few rows of benches, a raised platform, and a judge who looked like she had zero patience for suburban drama. Good. We didn't bring drama. We brought proof. Karen walked in flanked by her lawyer, a polished corporate type with dead eyes and a voice like decaf coffee. She was dressed like a first lady at a garden party. Beige suit, pearls, hair sprayed into immortality. Her face was calm. I almost respected the performance. Almost. Phil opened strong. He presented the forged work order immediately, comparing it side by side with verified documents that had my actual signature. The difference was obvious. The judge squinted, nodded, and jotted something down. Then he rolled out the site photos, before and after. The memorial bench, the flowers, the concrete slab now spidering with small surface cracks. And then came the drainage report. Due to the slope and a lack of subsurface grading, Phil said, the installed structure directs stormwater runoff toward the property's foundation. Long-term exposure could cause structural instability, erosion, and subsurface mold. Estimated restoration cost exceeds $35,000. Karen's lawyer objected on grounds of speculation. The judge allowed it. Speculation wasn't the claim. The damage was. Then came Denny. I didn't know what to expect from him when he walked up to the stand. He looked uncomfortable in a collared shirt, as if it was choking him. But when he started talking, the room shifted. He wasn't just nervous. He was ashamed. She called me directly, he said, voice low but steady. Told me the homeowner had already agreed, but needed the job done while he was away. Said I'd lose future contracts if I didn't make it quick. She faxed me the signature and said the original was in archives. I didn't question it. I should have. But she sounded like she ran the whole street. Phil asked, did she mention that the property was outside the HOA? Denny nodded. She said it didn't matter, that they had the right to improve aesthetic continuity. I didn't think to check. I just did the job. Do you regret it? Denny swallowed hard. I paved over a goddamn memorial garden. Yeah, I regret it every day. Karen's lawyer tried to discredit him, said he was seeking to avoid liability. Denny didn't flinch. Lady, if I wanted to avoid liability, I wouldn't be here. The courtroom chuckled. Even the judge cracked a smile. Next came Carl. The poor guy looked like a man dragging a confession to the gallows. He confirmed under oath that Karen had bypassed the HOA board, that she'd filed a protocol no one approved, then altered the meeting minutes to make it look unanimous. He showed copies of emails where Karen called other members dead weight and warned them to stay in line or get replaced. She'd used budget funds to print flyers, buy signage, and hire compliance officers. None of it approved, none of it within. The bylaws. Then came the big one. The county inspector. She took the stand with a thick folder. She'd been part of the official investigation launched by the DA's office weeks earlier. What she found was damning. Multiple unauthorized enhancements were performed outside the HOA's jurisdiction, she said. These include structural modifications, non-permitted landscaping, and at least 2 instances of forced compliance on non-member properties. The HOA's actions constitute a breach of municipal zoning protocol and may represent criminal trespass. Karen's lawyer began to sweat. I didn't. I just watched her. Karen didn't blink. Not once. Then, as if the universe decided it hadn't humiliated her enough, Phil pulled out his last card, a printed copy of Karen's HOA group chat logs leaked by a now former board member. The chat included statements like, "They'll cave." They always do. We can't have him dragging down property values with that lawn. I don't care if he's not a member. If he wanted freedom, he should have moved to the woods. The judge didn't say anything at first. She just leaned back and stared at Karen like someone reevaluating a wine label after finding out it came from a gas station. Karen finally spoke, briefly. Her lawyer asked if she'd like to clarify anything. She stood, adjusted her jacket, and said, "I acted in the best interest of the community." That was it. Phil stared at her like she'd just confessed to being a Bond villain. Outside the courtroom, reporters had gathered. The story had grown legs. HOA gone rogue. Veterans Memorial destroyed in HOA war zone. Texas man sues for freedom from concrete tyranny. I said nothing to the cameras. Just walked out with my daughter, who looked up at me and said, "Can we burn the sign when this is over?" "You read my mind," I said. But the trial wasn't quite over. The judge ordered a recess until the next morning for deliberations. We had done what we could. The evidence was out. The rot was exposed. Now all that remained was whether justice would stick. The courtroom was packed when we returned the next morning. Not just with lawyers, reporters, and concerned citizens, but with people, neighbors, many of whom I'd never even met. Folks from outside Sunridge Oaks, property owners who had stories of their own. People who had stayed silent for years, assuming no one would believe them, or worse, that they were the only ones. Karen sat at the defense table like a woman who still believed the world would bend to her spine-straight posture. Her hair was immaculate, her hands folded neatly over a leather-bound planner. But her face was different now. The smugness had calcified into something brittle, not fear exactly, but certainty cracking at the edges. The judge called the court to order, her voice firm. Having reviewed the testimony's documentation and the extensive record of actions undertaken by the Sunridge Oaks Homeowners Association, this court finds the following. Everyone leaned in. Even the air held its breath. 1. The HOA had no legal jurisdiction over the plaintiff's property, as confirmed by county records and zoning designations. 2. The alteration of said property, including the destruction of landscaping, installation of non-permitted concrete structures, and placement of signage, was executed without the owner's consent and constitutes trespass and property damage. Karen didn't blink. 3. The document used to authorize this work bears a forged signature as verified by expert testimony. 4. The defendant, Karen Whitman, acting as HOA president, initiated this work knowingly and with malicious intent, as evidenced by both written correspondence and witness statements. I felt the words sink in like heavy water. 5. Financial restitution shall be awarded in the amount of $275,000, covering estimated structural repair costs, full restoration of the plaintiff's original landscape, and punitive damages related to emotional distress and the desecration of a memorial site. Karen's hands twitched. And 6, the judge continued, in light of findings submitted by the district attorney's office, this court refers Karen Whitman for criminal prosecution on counts of document forgery, misappropriation of HOA funds, unlawful property interference, and intimidation of multiple homeowners, including a decorated military veteran. Then she looked directly at Karen. Mrs. Whitman, this is not a case of overreach. This is a case of abuse, of power, of process, and of people. You will be remanded into custody immediately pending arraignment on the above charges. The bailiff stepped forward. Karen stood slowly, as if her knees might give, but even now she tried to play the martyr. As she was cuffed, she turned to the crowd and said, voice low but clear, I only wanted what was best for the neighborhood. Someone behind me muttered, you paved over a dead woman's garden. Karen didn't respond. She just walked out, flanked by the 2 deputies, head high like she thought history might still see her as a misunderstood visionary. It wouldn't. Outside, the courthouse steps buzzed with news cameras and local anchors giving breathless reports. I gave one short interview. Just one. I looked into the camera and said, this wasn't about a lawn. It was about control. And we're done letting people like that bully entire communities into silence. I didn't wait for follow-up questions. Back home, the sign was gone, removed that afternoon by county workers under order of the court. The concrete stayed a little longer, pending a certified removal crew, but already I could see the change. Neighbors waved when they passed. People dropped off pies. One kid, Jason and Alina's, left a handwritten note that said, I'm glad you won. Can we have a real block party now? We would. And somewhere inside, I knew Karen wouldn't understand any of it. Not the verdict. Not the fallout. Not the collective sigh of relief from dozens of homeowners who had been living in quiet fear. Her world was made of rules, and those rules had finally been used against her. 3 weeks after the verdict, the front lawn was a mess, and for once that felt right. The concrete had been jackhammered and carted away in sections, revealing scorched, compacted soil underneath. The flowers were gone, of course, and the old irrigation lines had been shattered beneath the slab. But I didn't mind the destruction. It was honest now. And for the first time in months, I felt like the land could breathe again. Like we all could. I was kneeling by the garden bed, trying to rework the soil by hand, when my daughter walked out with 2 lemonades and a smirk on her face. She's on TV, she said, handing me a glass. I stood up, wiped my hands, and followed her inside. The news segment was already mid-roll. Inside the cell, HOA president speaks out. The local station had somehow scored an exclusive interview with Karen Whitman. There she was, seated stiffly in a beige prison-issued jumpsuit, hair slightly less perfect but still clearly dyed, her posture as upright as ever. She looked at the camera the same way she looked at the judge, like she was speaking to an audience that just didn't get it. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone, Karen said, eyes steady. I only wanted to maintain order. People don't realize how quickly a neighborhood can spiral when one person decides the rules don't apply. I was trying to protect the community. Sometimes leadership means making unpopular decisions. The reporter asked, do you regret falsifying documents or using funds without approval? Karen didn't hesitate. I regret that it came to that. But I still believe what I did was necessary. I just didn't think they'd fight back. My daughter muted the TV. She still thinks she's the hero. She always did, I said. Phil had told me Karen's trial on the criminal charges was scheduled for spring. She was facing multiple counts, document forgery, unlawful use of funds, criminal trespass, fraud, and attempted intimidation. Minimum sentencing guidelines meant she'd be inside for years. But even in jail, she hadn't cracked. She wasn't raging or crying. She was trying to spin it into legacy, as if future HOAS would name bylaws after her. Outside, a truck pulled up. Ron stepped out with a shovel in one hand and a flat of new seedlings in the other. Thought you could use some help rebuilding what she tried to erase, he said. Behind him, Maureen and Alina showed up, each with gloves and baskets of cuttings. Even Carl came, carrying a folding chair and a cooler. We didn't say much at first, just worked, dug, replanted. We rebuilt the garden. The new bench was simple, pine wood, sealed and clean. My daughter burned a quote into the backrest. No more concrete over memories. We mounted a small plaque beside it that read, "Private property, no HOA. No trespassing, no Karens." By evening, the front yard looked more alive than it ever had. Not perfect, but real. Not imposed, but chosen. As the sun dipped behind the hills, we lit the grill, cracked beers, and turned the once battleground into a backyard again. Phil showed up late, holding court with Carl and a few others. Someone brought up forming a neighborhood coalition, but we laughed it off. "No more structures," I said. "Just people who talk to each other." The barbecue lasted until well past dark. I stood at the edge of the lawn looking out at what had once been a slab of domination, now blooming with color again. Not the same as before, but nothing ever is after a war. Inside, the mailbox held a final envelope from the court. Confirmation of restitution payments, notification that the HOA had been officially dissolved after a board vote, and that all pending liens under their name had been invalidated. Karen had fallen. Her empire of ornamental tyranny was no more. And the neighborhood. It finally started to feel like one, not because of her rules, but because we'd learned how to stand up for our own.